citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens. Same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome to another episode of the People Powered Planet podcast, where each week we bring you special guests, not to talk about all the terrible problems in the world, and there sure are many, but to talk about solutionaries who can brighten our day with a vision for the kind of world we want to build together. So this is a place where we come together to work on how do we solve the problems and how do we build a people-powered planet, a world that works for everyone. And today we have a very, very special guest. It's Glen Anderson, who is a TV host on a fabulous, it's a cable TV show out of Thurston Community TV in Washington State. And both Melanie and I have been guests on his program, and we know he asks great questions and has a wonderful program. He's been running this program since 1987. He's had more than 400 shows talking to all kinds of fascinating, interesting people around the world. And not only can they, of course, watch it there in Thurston, but anyone, anywhere in the world, all of you can tune into his station, look at some of the replays, and can get to watch it online. So he covers not only issues of nonviolence and social justice, but all kinds of key progressive issues. And really, Glen is a very unique person in his kind of unique perspective on how we can have a peaceful foreign policy, how we can create a just social community, and the ways we can promote nonviolence at all levels in our society. And you know, he not only does he do his TV programs, but he writes, he runs training workshops. Melanie took his training workshop on nonviolence, very, very powerful and well done. He does works with grassroots social change movements. So this is a great opportunity to have Glen on our show. Welcome, Glen, to the People Powered Planet podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I enjoy these Wednesday morning programs that you folks put on, and I'm happy to be the guest for today. So this will be fun. It'll be fun for me. I hope it'll be fun for you as well.
Great. Let's start a little bit just with a little personal side of it. Can you tell us a little bit more how you got started in your journey? You know, where in your life were you as a young man that set you on this course? Or
yeah, people often ask me that, and so I always say there are three main sources of my commitment to peace and nonviolence. One is my parents were horribly mismatched and they never got along. We had constant conflict in the home when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s and since. And even as a kid, I kept thinking there have got to be better ways of solving problems and resolving conflicts than what I see here at home. That was one source. Second was that as a young person, I was seeing the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War and other problems. And I thought, we got to solve a lot of big problems. And a third source is I grew up in a mainstream church that had mainstream theology, but they did not recognize how radically, powerfully nonviolent was the original message of Jesus and the early church. And I thought, these folks are missing the point. There's a lot more radical stuff than just this mainstream theology. So those are the three sources that got me going. And I've been active as a volunteer in the nonviolent wing of the peace and justice movement since the 60s.
Wow. Well, that's quite a story. And it's so fascinating how people handle conflicts in different ways. Some people would shrink back from that conflict. You were a solutionary for working out. How are we going to fix this?
Today, I want us to look at how a nonviolent foreign policy would make us actually more secure than the foreign policy and the national security policies based on violence and nuclear weapons. So I want to provide information and inspiration to significantly improve the US's national security by ironically demilitarizing our national defense.
That's so important. Yes, that's so important because many people think that we're putting a lot of money into a defense budget, but we're not. We're putting into an undefensed budget.
Yeah.
And you have some ideas about how it can actually get more safe and secure rather
Right.
than consistently getting less safe and secure. And so throwing more money in to think maybe that'll do it.
Yeah, so the current national defense mantra is actually backwards from what we need. It promotes violence as a way of having peace, and that just doesn't work. And instead of military violence, we could defend our nation better through carefully planned strategies of nonviolent resistance. And so besides eliminating the danger of nuclear war, a nonviolent national defense would also provide better security without all the downsides that violent militarism causes. So I want to show you the topics that I want to cover here. I'll be encouraging us to think open-mindedly, boldly, and creatively. And I'll explain how nonviolent national defense could actually work effectively. I'll share some examples of nonviolent resistance that's been used effectively in other countries. And I'll mention obstacles that we have to overcome in order to make this radical change. So that's where we're headed. And then in the longer materials I have available on my blog, you can read points 5 and 6. So the first thing I want to mention is that nuclear weapons are not practical, because instead of protecting us, they eventually will kill all of us unless we abolish the nuclear weapons before they kill us. So likewise, militarism itself is a phony solution. And I'll explain here how a nonviolent national defense would actually make us more secure and solve some other problems.
Yes, well, that's very much in line with what President Kennedy told us way back in the 60s, where he said the weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
Yep.
That was the president giving that warning and telling the entire UN. And if we had heeded him, we would be in a lot better shape.
Right. So militarism itself really is a phony solution, and thousands of years of wars have not brought peace. The people who promoted World War I promised that it would be the war to end all wars. And have we had a century of peace since 1918? Wars do not bring peace. You have to replace war as a system with nonviolent alternatives. And when we're chronically stuck in a dysfunctional system, we need to challenge the longstanding assumptions that prop up that dysfunctional system. And we need to think creatively, think outside the box, and choose bold, positive alternatives to that stupid status quo.
By the way, I think it's so important that you're talking about system level change. So many people fight and struggle to try to stop this war and try to stop that war and lobby against this war and lobby against that defense bill, when the entire system, it doesn't matter if you stop one, it'll just pop up another place unless we make some system level changes, right?
Yeah, and we've been doing this as even after the Cold War, we've been doing this, but even during the Cold War, we were doing all kinds of that. And politics as usual has gotten us into this mess. So politics as usual cannot get us out of it. Both political parties are obsessed with military violence and nuclear weapons as if those were the solutions. And it's got to be people from below, the grassroots, to change those systems. For thousands of years, and in most parts of the world, people have assumed that violence solves problems. Actually, the problem is violence itself. And we need to ground ourselves in our best values and think very creatively and boldly so we can create a fresh alternative, nonviolent national defense, and that's what will make us truly secure. The U.S. needs to renounce militarism and replace it with a nonviolent national defense. So instead of oppression from the top down, we can empower the grassroots to achieve real national security from the bottom up through nonviolent people power. And I'm glad you have a people-powered planet, because this is what we need to be doing. It's changing, it flips it upside down. And nonviolent national defense would protect us even if other nations do not join us. And I'll explain how that works. And I've been studying and strongly supporting nonviolent national defense for nearly half a century. And other people have been doing this too, but it just gets squeezed out of the national debate. You never hear anybody prominent talk about nonviolent national defense. Decades ago, I figured out an overall plan for why and how a nonviolent national defense could actually work in the United States. During the Cold War, Americans were afraid of two dangers. Danger number one was a nuclear war could actually occur or the Soviet Union could threaten us with a nuclear attack and use that threat of a nuclear war to force us to surrender to them. Danger number two was that the Soviet Union's military could actually invade and conquer the US and use our industrial and agricultural resources to export them to the Soviet Union. And nonviolent national defense would protect us from both of those dangers. I want to mention danger number one and then danger number two. Danger one, the United States has always been willing to start a nuclear war, and indeed the US unilaterally escalated a conventional war, World War II, into an atomic war when we dropped atomic bombs in Japan. The US has never had a no first use policy, and first use willingness to start a war has continued from all presidents from 1940s all the way up through Biden now. And after World War II ended, the US started to aggressively build nuclear weapons and launched a nuclear arms race that frightened the hell out of the Soviet Union. Russia has a long history of centuries of attacks by other nations, and they were afraid of a nuclear attack by the US. So in Russia, or the Soviet Union, in order to protect their own national security, felt the need to build their own nuclear weapons. The United States led each escalation in the nuclear arms race, and the USSR kept trying to catch up and match the US's weapons and strategies. And after the Cold War ended, the US pushed NATO and nuclear weapons right up to Russia's borders. So we're continuing that threat, and we see how they react. They feel like they,
That's such an important point to bring out, because we see a world today where people say, "Oh, there was this unprovoked attack on Ukraine," and we don't think about how would the U.S. feel if nuclear weapons were being moved up into Mexico and Canada and Cuba and all the islands there, and just surrounding us with nukes so close that they could just reach us with little or no warning.
Yeah, a key principle in nonviolence is to be able to see things from other people's perspectives and not just through our own filters. So the Arthur's point is right on. If the US had no nuclear weapons, the Cold War fear of danger number one would vanish. The Soviet Union, and now Russia, would not have felt a defensive need for nuclear weapons or to attack the US. And also, abolishing our nuclear weapons would eliminate the danger of a war starting by accident, miscalculation, or computer error. And we know computers make mistakes, and there have been a lot of mistakes and near misses. I want to mention danger number two, and then I'll be fleshing that out in a moment. During the Cold War, the second kind of fear was that the Soviet Union's military could invade and conquer the US and use our industrial and agricultural resources and export them to the Soviet Union. And I'll explain in just a moment how a nonviolent national defense would eliminate that danger too. If the Soviet Union were to send many, many thousand military troops to invade and conquer the US and use those troops to run our factories and farms and export those products back to the Soviet Union, nonviolent national defense could actually protect us against that. And they would have to send many hundreds of thousands of Soviet military troops, and that would be far too many than they could send quickly in airplanes, right? They'd have to send them on many ocean-going ships, which would take a number of days to get here. The US monitors what goes on all over the world. So if we saw many, many ships coming from the Soviet Union, or now Russia, to the US, traveling across the oceans, we would have several days of advance warning before they arrived here. During that time, we would use those days to activate a nonviolent national defense plan that we will have organized in advance. We would protect the US nonviolently from danger number two. And here's how we would do it. The US could abolish our military and develop a nonviolent national defense plan that would train millions of ordinary American civilians how to nonviolently resist an invasion and an occupation by any foreign nation. If Paraguay or Zimbabwe or somebody wanted to attack us, this would work too. Actually, a population can nonviolently refuse to be governed, so no dictator can prevail if enough people resist through clever nonviolent means. And in fact, people in other countries have done this, as I'll mention in just a moment. From 1968 to 1971, I worked every summer at a big industrial plant that looked a lot like this, along with 380 other men, and they would not hire women. Every worker had his own specific job, and every worker had access to various kinds of industrial equipment, tools, and so forth. Instead of 380 men paying taxes so the federal government could hire American military troops and pay giant business corporations to manufacture weapons to protect us from the Soviet invaders, suppose we saved all that money, and for a tiny, tiny fraction of that cost, suppose we trained ourselves how to nonviolently resist a Soviet invasion. We could train ourselves how to nonviolently prevent Soviet troops from occupying our industrial plant, like the one that you see on the screen here, and any other parts of the American economy. So if our government recognized that Soviet troop ships were heading our way across the oceans, we would have several days in which to shut down our industrial plant and go home. But before leaving our work site, each of the 380 employees would take certain pre-planned nonviolent actions to make the factory impossible for Russians to operate. And we would make for ourselves explicit notes of what we were doing so that we could reverse our changes after we have repelled the Soviet invasion nonviolently by letting the Soviets know that attacking us and invading would be futile. If we saw during this Cold War Soviet troops coming here on troop ships across the oceans, we'd have a few days to reverse the wiring of several pieces of crucial equipment and write down what we were doing. For other kinds of crucial equipment, we could reverse the inlet and outlet pipes and the inlet and outlet hoses and write down what we were doing so we could reverse them after we've repelled the invasion. We could open the glass cover of many gauges and replace their faces with phony gauge faces. For example, if you have a gauge that mentions kilowatt hours, you put up a phony gauge face that says water pressure pounds per square inch. There are all kinds of ways that you could sabotage the plant nonviolently and be able to reverse it after we've succeeded in stopping the invasion. So each employee could also take home a few crucial valves, handles, and so forth. Workers would figure out their own plans and write the plan down, and so we could reverse them just in case. Nobody who is already intimately familiar with the complexities of this big industrial plant would be able to figure out the thousands of things that had been nonviolently disrupted, so no foreign invader could operate it. And imagine developing this kind of nonviolent defense for every industrial plant in the nation, and every utility, and every part of the US news media, and every farm across the nation. And if we told other nations who might be attacking us that we're going to do this so you will not be able to occupy us and use our resources to export back to your country, it would convince them that invading us would be futile. Now, generally, militaries practice a lot of secrecy, and here we would still keep the details secret, but we would tell them publicly that we will be nonviolently preventing an invasion by preventing you from using our resources. So these are creative, nonviolent resistance actions that would actually prevent the invasion, and that addresses the danger number 2 that I mentioned. And also, unlike a war, nobody would die. The kind of nonviolent national defense plan that I propose here would cause some inconvenience and some suffering American people, but far less suffering than a conventional war would cause, and only a very tiny, tiny, tiny amount of the suffering that a nuclear war would cause. This would eliminate nuclear war, as I mentioned in the response to danger 1, and prevent an invasion like from number 2. So a nonviolent national defense really is practical, and it would be more effective defense and safer defense compared to the military defense.
What's interesting is how have some of these techniques of changing things so to confuse an invader been actually used by some of the people in Ukraine that have wanted to do a nonviolent defense?
Yeah, the media and the politicians here keep talking about the military defense, but there actually has been a fair amount of nonviolent defense. It just does not get reported in the press, and the US politicians don't want to reinforce the power and practicality of nonviolent defense because we're so enmeshed in militarism. But I do want to offer some examples, like Arthur suggested, about other countries.
Yeah, like it isn't one example the changing of street signs. That's very much along the same.
Right. Yeah, I'll mention that in just a moment in Czechoslovakia in '68. But India, a poor nation, won independence from the British Empire after decades of nonviolent resistance. Mahatma Gandhi devised a radically bold nonviolent campaign soon after 1900, and they persistently organized a courageous nonviolent movement that won independence from the British Empire in 1947. And Arthur mentioned the Czechoslovakia in 1968 example. During the Cold War, Czechoslovakia was dominated by and oppressed by the Soviet Union, but the Czech people wanted to move their nation in more humane and progressive directions. Soviet Union tried to stop those reforms. And so in 1968, August, the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia so they could impose tight controls on the nation. The Soviet Union expected a military resistance, which they could have easily crushed. But instead of a military resistance, the Czech people resisted nonviolently in a variety of very creative ways. And all the way from government officials down to ordinary people, nonviolently resisted the occupation. One example that Arthur mentioned is the Soviet tanks and military vehicles where they had maps, drive here, drive there, whatever, but people took down the street signs and they painted over the house numbers or the street address numbers on the buildings. So the Soviet tank drivers and military truck drivers got lost. Local people knew where they were because that was their hometown, right? And there were lots and lots and lots of other nonviolent things. Just imagine how much more effective the Czech people could have been if they had planned out in advance nonviolent resistance strategies instead of having to improvise ad hoc. Another example, during the 1990s, Serbia's leader, Slobodan Milosevic, was cruel and oppressive. A nonviolent resistance organization named Otpor arose that reached out to many, many kinds of people throughout the nation. They used creative publicity. They promoted nonviolent civil resistance that won many people onto their side because they were nonviolent instead of threatening. And they actually forced the oppressor Milosevic to resign in the year 2000. And I highly recommend the fascinating and informative documentary film about this titled Bring Down a Dictator. And that Iran's people nonviolently overthrew the US's heavily armed dictator, the Shah, in 1979. In the early 1950s, Iran briefly had a democracy, and in 1953, Iran's people democratically elected a new prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and he took action to nationalize the Iranian oil resources so the Iranian people would benefit from the profits instead of going to a British oil company. But Britain and the US, the CIA and the British equivalent, did not want that. So they overthrew Iran's democracy. They installed this brutal dictator, the Shah, and he was extremely brutal. He violently oppressed Iran's people, and the United States armed the Shah with huge amounts of US military weapons, including our most sophisticated jet fighter planes. And his extreme brutality and his secret police caused Amnesty International to denounce him as the world's very worst abuser of human rights. But in 1979, after 26 years of the Shah's extremely brutal dictatorship, Iranian people rose up and nonviolently protested in the streets until they forced him to nonviolently to give up and left the country. Nonviolence really is that powerful. And we've had this in a bunch of other countries as well. I want to show in the Philippines, nonviolent people power removed the US-backed dictator Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. The US's rabid Cold War mania caused the US to support brutal dictators who served the US's Cold War policies. This included not only the Shah of Iran, but also Ferdinand Marcos, who was dictator of the Philippines for 20 years. And he allowed the US to use the Philippines to run our gigantic military war against Vietnam. But a nonviolent people power movement arose in the Philippines with broad public support, including a lot of Catholic priests and nuns. So we had people in the religious community as well as a lot of other people doing this. And Arthur knows about the singing revolution in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia in the late 1980s. This was a great success that most people in the US don't know about. After World War II, the Soviet Union absorbed Estonia, Lithuania, and and Latvia and tried to make them all Russian in language and culture and politics, but those people wanted to keep their own cultures. The Soviet Union tried to impose the Russian language upon them, but local people asserted their own nationalities by increasing the use of their own national languages. They nonviolently gathered together in larger and larger numbers and more often to sing their traditional folk songs in their native languages. And this became a nonviolent movement for independence. And this totally nonviolent singing revolution was so successful that Estonia became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. And you can learn more about this by searching the internet for the singing revolution. And also in 2004, 2005, in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution replaced Ukraine's corrupt government with an honest democracy. And you can do a web search for Orange Revolution. And it just goes on and on and on. There are lots of examples in lots of places beyond what I have the time to say here.
That's so interesting, though, that what you mentioned about the Orange Revolution, because so many people right now, think, oh, here's this powerful resistance to the Soviets with military power, and yet what's that doing to their society? And why was it that Ukraine, because they already had an Orange Revolution, couldn't they have succeeded in doing a nonviolent revolution to the Soviet invasion?
Yeah, there have been people using nonviolence, but they get squelched by the dominant politicians and news media and the obsessive mania that says violence is what solves problems. And if we were to pay attention to the nonviolent resistance that's been occurring and lift that up, we could shift things. Anyway, so yeah, right on. I want to just mention a lot of power of this. Gene Sharp, Gene Sharp, Sharp, was the world's top expert on nonviolent resistance throughout history, and he explained clearly and convincingly how to use nonviolence effectively to overthrow dictators and repel invaders. He researched the power and practicality of nonviolent organizing against oppressors, invaders, and other kinds of violence and injustice. And his research led him to write a number of books, which I've read starting in the 1970s. And many of his books and pamphlets have been translated into other languages, and they've been used effectively to nonviolently overthrow dictatorships in many nations. And the nonprofit organization, the Albert Einstein Institution, offers many of his books and pamphlets for sale, and you can download and print out some of them for free. The website is www.einstein.org. During the bicentennial year in the US of 1976, he wrote an article explaining how nonviolent resistance to the British Empire was making very good progress toward freeing the 13 American colonies from the British Empire. And he explained in this article that he wrote in 1976 that he made a solid case that the 13 colonies would have achieved independence from England sooner if we had not resorted to military violence and the Revolutionary War. Because when the American colonists started shooting British troops, England became angry at us and they started making war against us. And the war went on for a number of years. Of nonviolent resistance had been making progress, we would have gotten our independence sooner without the Revolutionary War.
That's a very important point you're mentioning that people don't realize. I think Gene Sharp actually makes the case that the revolution, that the independence was already won by things like the Tea Party and the colonies refusing to cooperate, and England has lost control. We had already basically won our independence when the hotheads started shooting, and then the war came on. The war was kind of an aftermath to our independence. And isn't that right?
Yes. So we could have gotten the independence without the war, and it would have been happening sooner.
And that happened in Canada, right? They got theirs without a war.
Nonviolent national defense is better than militarism in many ways. One is it's more effective than the violent military that we have. And the last significant war that we won was actually World War II. And that was more than 7 decades ago. We've lost all the wars since then. Militarism does not work. And nonviolence is vastly cheaper than the military budget. So replacing the military with a much cheaper nonviolent defense strategy would enable our nation to afford to use the savings to end all poverty nationwide, provide high quality health care for everybody in the nation, clean up the environment, replace deteriorating infrastructure, rapidly convert to a sustainable climate. The military budget is preventing us from solving our nation's real problems. And we could have a nonviolent national defense and solve the problems. Nonviolence is environmentally sustainable, whereas the military has a huge waste of natural resources, pollution of lands and waters, gigantic climate pollution, and so forth. Nonviolence also is profoundly democratic and grassrootsy because it's bottom up instead of the military establishment's authoritarianism that really oppresses us and endangers us from the top down. Nonviolence is also better for the economy because U.S. militarism is designed to support big capitalistic businesses that exploit other nations through our violent foreign policy, and also to have the United States corporations spend taxpayer money on weapons. And economists since the 1950s have been proving that $1 billion spent for peaceful purposes like housing, education, and healthcare creates more jobs and better jobs than military weapons. So I want to just mention two obstacles. One is the mistaken assumption that violence solves problems and that militarism is the only way to defend ourselves. We need to debunk that obstacle. And obstacle two is the enormous corrupting power of big corporations that sell to the military and fund the politicians' campaigns. So we need to get big money out of election campaigns, and we need to stop the assumptions that violence is what solves problems.
Thank you very much, Glenn. If only we had a rational world, then all the things you're saying would be already implemented and we would go better. But somehow we've got to touch people's hearts and emotions and move them in some emotional manner to get out of the current almost like mesmerized hypnotic belief in the power of militarism, even though it's repeatedly failed and been proven a failure. People still subscribe to it. So let's turn to the questions and see if people have some questions about how we can move forward on this. Melanie?
Thank you, Arthur. Yes, good point. And Glenn, you're so full of information. Oh my gosh, you know everything. So yes, we do have some questions, and I'd like to go first to Michael. Michael, go right ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here, and wonderful talk. So much to think about, and thank you for the resources you're sharing with us. So in two parts, I'd like to start with an observation or a suggestion to like a global solution. And then I have a question about the Iranian revolution and what's going on over there, which is, I think we could address. So first of all, for the United States military, which is so extensive and military bases all over the world, and so much spending and so much of an organization in place, it seems that in order to be practical and solutionary, if we could somehow create an alternative mission, a whole new attitude about what their mission is, as far as think of it in terms of in alignment with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where we would, use these military bases and use our, the reach of all of our ships in order to deploy the best technology for sustainable infrastructure for less developed countries, to help them develop wisely without fossil fuels, to help them build sustainable villages. And you could actually come up with a system where you're actually meshing with capitalism, whereas American businesses would be providing that technology, whether it's solar panels, water filtration, good building techniques, agricultural best practices, and so on. So the American businesses would reap the benefits of starting new development in impoverished areas, where you actually end up building a customer base and you have people who will be buying your products, and find a way to kind of, you'd have to fund this with some sort of Marshall Plan funding. But think about how quickly, because it really seems, if you want to stop terrorism, if you want to stop poverty, we've got to have good infrastructure in as many places in the world as possible to keep people from resorting to, extreme individual, becoming a terrorist, or, people in poverty are entrepreneurs that are desperate for any kind of solution. So I think the United States could serve a role like that. So I'd love to hear your comments on that. And secondly, I'm terrified and horrified by what's going on in Iran with the young people throwing their lives on the line and getting abducted and then tortured and killed by the secret police or in Iran.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks. Yeah. I agree with your points in your first chunk there. Since the mid-70s, I've done a lot of economic research on converting the economy away from a military economy toward a peacetime economy. And part of what we need to be doing, and this is some of my research back from the 70s and organizing, is getting military bases to be converted to peaceful purposes and military industries to be converted to peaceful purposes. And so part of what we have to do is convert the economy. And unlike people who just say, let's just stop capitalism, that's just not going to happen. What we need to do is show how we would have a better economy if we could convert those businesses to other purposes. And in England, decades ago, the workers at their major military manufacturing plant, Lucas Aerospace, the workers developed a plan for how Lucas Aerospace could be converted into making peaceful products instead of military fighter planes. And I live in Olympia, 60 miles south of Seattle, and Boeing dominates Washington State, even after they moved their headquarters to Chicago and a lot of their airplane production to South Carolina, which is an anti-union state. But Boeing still dominates us. And decades ago, the International Association of Machinists, the dominant union at Boeing making airplanes, their head of the International Association of Machinists International Union, William Winpisinger, and their union were saying we need to get out of the military business and into peaceful uses for our workers. So this is not an anti-labor thing. It doesn't have to be an anti-business thing. We need to just convert that. And in about 1979 or 80, I worked with some state legislators and we got some legislation introduced. And I testified at the legislative hearings about studying the extent to which Washington State's economy is dependent on the military and how we can explore economic alternatives. So what we need to do is open up that thinking, like Michael said, and get out of this trap that we're in this box, and open up our thinking. So a Marshall Plan for this, having our businesses do things better in other countries than the oppression that goes on. We need to open up our thinking. So that's one. And on the Iran issue, yeah, these people are suffering. Some are being killed, but this nonviolent revolution led by women in this heavily sexist society, that's a powerful bottom-up thing. And people do suffer and even die in nonviolent campaigns, but far less than if Iran were to have a militaristic civil war trying to violently overthrow their government. So nonviolence and grassroots organizing is still the way to go. Thanks, Michael.
Great questions. Thank you, Michael. And now we'd like to go to David Hartsoe.
Thank you, Glenn, for excellent presentation and for all you do to promote active nonviolence over the years and decades. My question is relating to Ukraine. What would I think the examples you gave of Czechoslovakia, et cetera, were helpful. But if there had been a blueprint of how to effectively, non-violently resist an invasion of 100,000 troops and their tanks, I believe that especially all the Ukrainian people have suffered during this war. If they had seen a viable alternative where they could effectively resist this Soviet or Russian invasion, I think they would have chosen that.
Yes.
And I think this would be very important for any future places that have this kind of problem, including by American invasions. But anyway, do you have further thoughts about what a nonviolent resistance against a invasion with 100,000 troops crossing the border, ready to take over the country. I think it would be important for the people of Ukraine, but also the whole world.
Yeah, I agree. And the people in Czechoslovakia in 1968 did a lot of nonviolent resistance, created things besides the street sign and building number addresses. There's a lot more stuff I didn't have time to mention, but they did all that spontaneously. And what I'm suggesting with the example from the industrial plant that I work in is if we plan this out in advance and tell any potential invader, we are ready to prevent you from occupying us and using our resources, and you will not succeed. That can be a good deterrent, better than a nuclear deterrent. And also the people in some places have, I mean, we've seen photos of putting flowers in the barrels of the guns of invading soldiers and stuff. And in some places, people come out with chocolates and say, "Here, let's not be have animosity toward each other. Let's settle things down." And if people have nonviolent strategies of, instead of violently opposing, nonviolently accommodating, and turning one of the things they did in Serbia about Milosevic was the people, instead of attacking the police and the military that were under Milosevic's control, they reached out to them and said, "Come on, we're all Serbs here. Let's not be shooting each other." And a number of people in the Serbian military and higher levels of Serbia's military police agencies realized, hey, my kids are in the movement against Milosevic. I don't want to be shooting my kids or my kids' friends. So we need to do this in advance and do this in a way that is not violent or threatening, so that it's possible for people in the military or the police to lay down their arms, which is a lot of what happened in Serbia and brought down Milosevic. This is part of Gene Sharp's strategies, where he says you got to find ways to weaken their commitment to oppressing you, because if we nonviolently refuse to be oppressed, nobody can oppress us if we nonviolently refuse. So I'm right with you, David, and pre-planning is good, thinking outside the box is good, and we just don't see that enough in this country or other countries.
I would still encourage you or someone to write up what could have been a nonviolent alternative to resisting the Russian invasion,
Yeah.
which the whole world could look at and say, oh, well, that would have been a lot better than risking nuclear war.
Yeah, I don't have the expertise about Ukraine's the situation, but the longer essay that I posted the link to in my blog expands on what I'm saying here today. Okay. But I agree with you. It would be good for somebody who knows Ukraine to be able to say, here are some things that could have worked, but we can learn from other nations that have done this kind of stuff. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Yes, that would be a great book. What Ukraine could have done, or something, some catchy title. That would be so great. And a lot of people are just getting this information, and it's so important to know, and it's just so powerful, so powerful. So okay, so now let's go back to another question. Jerry, you're next. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Melanie. Glenn, I appreciated your presentation. I think it's what you get at really is that government is ruled by the consent of the people. And if you don't have the consent of the people, you can't rule. And this has brought down many dictators and changed many governments. And I know, I mean, there's great places where nonviolence has worked, but I see, and I want to get your take on this. I'm a longtime world federalist, and I've been involved with Citizens for Global Solutions, and I support the idea of creating a world government or world parliament, court system. And I see what happened in Ukraine as a failure of the international international law, that what the Russians did was a violation of international law.
Yeah.
They're on the Security Council. They have the right to veto according to rules. We really live in a world of anarchy, and that's what I think is the heart of the problem as far as why there's violence. The purpose of government is to solve conflicts with nonviolence. That is the purpose of law. So I wanted to get your take on that. Do you support the idea of, creating a world parliament,
Yes.
world government, that kind of thing? And just maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Sure.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And I support the efforts of Melanie and Arthur in saying, we need to recognize ourselves as citizens of the whole world, not in narrow nationalistic things. And when Jerry, your point about the Ukraine example where Russia was allowed to do that, the United States does that to a bunch of other nations. We've been doing it
Yes.
a long time. And so the United States is in no moral position to denounce the Russia for doing it when we do the same thing. And what we need to have is that global consciousness and a world sense. And so you mentioned like the Security Council where nations veto things. The progress that we've made recently in the UN has been through the General Assembly where nobody has a veto. And this is where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons passed with 122 votes of 193 nations in July of 2017. And nobody was able to veto it because it was the General Assembly. This is a world bottom-up thing speaking. And so we need to be supporting the United Nations as a step toward the right direction and helping people use that General Assembly and other UN agencies, but also keep working for a global system that will transcend the nationalistic power. So I'm right with you, Jerry. Thank you for that
Thank
point.
you, Glenn.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yay. Oh, yes. Yes. I love it. Last question we have time for, and Mike, go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. I have actually two questions, Glenn. What do you think there's a gender factor in this, nonviolent possibilities? If more women were in leadership in countries, we would be moving towards nonviolent solutions. And also, what would you suggest how the US responds to North Korea in a nonviolent way? That guy scares me.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Two good questions here. One, some time ago, I saw a list of which nations have done the best job of saving their people's health from COVID, and the best nations were the ones that are headed by women. So, and I support this effort by a guy who I think was on your program some time ago, who's organizing a global peace movement led by women. That it's a fresh approach, and we need to be doing that. Regarding North Korea, most people in the US do not know that the Korean War never ended. We've had a ceasefire since the 1950s, but we never had an actual peace treaty. And so the United States has been continually threatening North Korea with our nuclear weapons since the 1950s. And North Korea, fearing for their own national security, figured out, geez, we got to have our own nuclear weapons because the United States attacks and overthrows the governments of many nations, but none that have nuclear weapons. So North Korea sees their own national security depending on North Korea having nuclear weapons to protect their national security from the US. So we need to get rid of nuclear weapons. We need to have an actual peace treaty with North Korea. And the first step toward that is to stop threatening them, stop doing these aggressive war games with South Korea, stop basing so many troops in South Korea. I mean, the United States government is doing everything they can to frighten the hell out of North Korea and propel them to make more nuclear weapons, which they're doing now, just like China is. China has recently started escalating their nuclear weapons because the United States is threatening a Cold War against China, and we got both political parties in the US doing that. So we need to reverse our foreign policy in all kinds of ways, change the whole dynamics. But the American people generally do not know, because both political parties have a shared monopoly on our understanding of what national security is. And the news media pretty much follow the American government party line about that. So that's my take on it.
Oh, wow. Now, we do have we're going to slip in a comment by Anne, and go right ahead with your comment.
Well, I just want to say a direct call to David Hartsoe, who was responsible for my becoming a peacekeeper with Nonviolent Peace Force. And that is a place that I learned by being an advocate, is that one of the reasons we can't get to peace is because we're so conflicted among us. All you need to do is look at the peace movement at the breakout of the Ukraine war, when so many peace-loving people took the side of Ukraine. Oh, those poor people, they have to win this war against those nasty Russians. Never a space for listening, dialogue, what could be, and not that it's our call to do this, but we have to think about how our own fragmentation is absolutely decimating any chance of peace. Nuclear weapons, anything like that. I am a big fan of Gene Sharp when he says he helps us do a study, and among his several works, do a study, just like Nonviolent Peace Force does in the field. They don't just go in being nonviolent, they go in with a study. They understand the conflicts, they understand the players, the history, and they have a plan. The plan is ongoing with every day, but nonetheless, they don't just go in there wandering around. So I think that those are wonderful models to follow and guide us. And then Gene Sharp also says that ultimately you end up changing a person, and you have to do a power analysis of your own nonviolent power and whatever power they have, and you never engage on their own battlefield. That's what I think is so beautiful about Gene Sharp. A lot of people take issue with him on a lot of things, but his power analysis model has has resolved a lot of problems in my life, just having problems with consulates and other kinds of issues, not in a war zone, but just other people whose behavior I want to change in my favor. I have to have power to do that, material resources, skills and knowledge, and all kinds of things. And sometimes speaking a language that they understand.
Yeah, thanks. And I agree with everything you said. One of the nice things about Gene Sharp's thinking is he says what he's promoting is not something based on morality, but he says nonviolence is what actually works, is practical. And he had resisted the draft during the Korean War, spent time in federal prison. When he got out, he realized that he had made his own personal statement against war by resisting the draft, but it did not change the power dynamics that cause wars. And so that prompted him to study this, and he came up with the kind of stuff that we've been talking about. I also support Nonviolent Peace Force. I've been financially supporting them since they were just beginning, and I did 2 of my TV programs with people who had helped get that going back when they were first getting going. And Nonviolent Peace Force practices nonviolence at a very personal, local level by dispelling fears, countering propaganda and stuff, getting people on the ground to be able to talk with each other. That's powerful stuff. That's really smart peacemaking. And we need Nonviolent Peace Force methodologies in the US as well. People who can bridge the gaps between communities that are at odds with each other.
And we do have it in the US too. In Minneapolis, we have some election teams and some local conflict teams in New York and Washington, DC. It's been a very, very exciting place to be for me in the last 15 years.
Thank you, Anne. And A big, huge thank you to you, Glenn. You are so knowledgeable. Thank you so much for giving this beautiful talk and also answering the questions. You're just it's so amazing, and I love listening to you, and I love your tone and the way you respond. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart. We'll go now to Arthur to close. Arthur, go, take it away.
Wow. Well, this has been a terrific presentation. And I think one of the things that I most loved was where you pointed out how strongly, you know, all this military force actually creates its enemies. It makes them angry. It makes them worse. You know, we talk about Kim Kimling scaring us. Well, what created him? What pushed the Taliban into power? It was the policies of militarism that pushes people into the hands of the worst dictators and the most oppressive people. So, you know, it's not war. You can't have a war for freedom. War is what ends freedom. War is what oppresses us. And the only way to have freedom and democracy is to abolish war. So thank you so much for your amazing presentation and for helping us see some very clear-sighted thinking that the world needs badly. Well, we so appreciate your joining us. We urge people to take a look at your website for some of your very interesting guests and podcasts. Glenn, do you want to give us a quick rundown again of how people see your past podcasts?
People can read a very thorough article that I wrote that's more thorough than the 1-hour TV program I did on this topic. And I encourage people to do that because it's got links to more information sources and more examples. And then my blog, parallaxperspectives.org, the TV programs I've done since January of 2018 are all there in the TV programs part. Some of the early ones are also on the different issue things, but Melanie was a guest twice on the program. Once, I think last November, talking about how we need to boldly get beyond the status quo and not just do the tiny incremental steps that the elites tell us, oh, this is all that's politically feasible, only do this. And Melanie and I made a big case saying, no, we need to be a lot more bold. She was a bold, humane future. And Arthur and Melanie were guests earlier in 2022 promoting the world is my country, the global citizenship. But we've had lots of other people. And since the pandemic has happened, I've been able to have guests from other places as well as the greater Olympia, Washington area. And so we cover economics, climate, nonviolence, social justice, everything.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now, so next week we have a very special opportunity to celebrate the anniversary, the second anniversary of the nuclear weapons ban treaty that actually has already made nuclear weapons illegal. They are illegal in the world. And next week, Melanie will tell you more about the document that she's helped create, where we, the people, can sign on and actually begin to enforce this agreement. And we can actually begin to let our banks and other people know that they are violating the law, and that in the countries where this has been passed, if they're doing business there, they may well be disrupting their bottom line, doing illegal activity that could damage their shareholders, their standing in the world. So we need to help enforce that treaty because we, the people, are the source of law. And that's next week, January 18th. And then the week after that, we have Savita on the alchemy of peace. She is an amazing, uplifting speaker, a very clear thinker about how we move toward the kind of global interactive bottom-up democracy that we're all advocating here. So glad to have all of you join us. Please do, actually, many of you are members and contribute each month. We really appreciate it. While you can have a free trial, we are very much in need of funds and hope that you will become a regular paying member for $10 each month. It's a small price to pay to keep us going and carrying out the important action we're doing to try to spread the message of the world is my country and of how we build a people-powered planet. So thank you so much, and we will see you all next week and every week on the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.